During my decades working in British prisons and public hospitals, I witnessed firsthand the methodical destruction of a civilization that once ruled the world. What alarms me most profoundly is observing America, that last bastion of individual responsibility and limited government, now racing down precisely the same destructive path. The parallels are not coincidental. They represent the systematic implementation of identical progressive ideologies that have already reduced Britain to a shadow of its former greatness. Through my clinical observations of how welfare dependency destroys the human spirit, how cultural relativism breeds moral chaos, and how sentimentalism masquerades as compassion while producing systematic cruelty, I've learned to recognize the unmistakable symptoms of civilizational decay. America today exhibits every pathological sign I documented in Britain's underclass 30 years ago. The question is no longer whether America will follow Britain's trajectory, but how quickly the transformation will complete itself. What I witnessed in Birmingham's hospitals, America's emergency rooms now display with frightening precision. Chapter 1: The Welfare State as Soul Destroyer. In my years treating patients whose lives had been systematically destroyed by Britain's welfare system, I observed a phenomenon that would have seemed impossible to previous generations: the creation of a permanent class of people whose very humanity had been corrupted by institutional dependency. Now I watch with horror as America implements identical policies with identical results. The welfare state doesn't merely fail to solve poverty, it creates a qualitatively different kind of human degradation. In British housing projects, I encountered young women who had never contemplated any life path except serial pregnancies by violent men, funded entirely by government benefits. These weren't women trapped by circumstances, they were products of a system that had made irresponsibility more profitable than virtue. The state had effectively purchased their independence and dignity, leaving behind hollow shells who mistook dependency for freedom. America's expansion of welfare programs produces precisely the same behavioral patterns I documented in Britain. When government subsidizes single motherhood, fatherlessness becomes an economic strategy rather than a personal tragedy. When benefits exceed the wages available to unskilled workers, employment becomes economically irrational. When housing, food, and healthcare are guaranteed regardless of behavior, the natural consequences that once taught responsibility disappear entirely. The psychological destruction runs deeper than mere economic dependency. In Britain, I observed how welfare recipients developed what I termed learned helplessness elevated to a philosophical principle. They genuinely believed themselves incapable of self-improvement, not because of any inherent limitation, but because the system had systematically taught them that external circumstances, never personal choices, determined life outcomes. American progressives celebrate these developments as compassionate social policy, precisely as their British counterparts did. They refuse to acknowledge what any practicing physician observes immediately, that removing the connection between choices and consequences doesn't eliminate suffering, it perpetuates and amplifies it while destroying the character traits necessary for human flourishing. The cruelest irony is that this systematic destruction of human agency is implemented by people who would never tolerate such dependency in their own lives. The educated classes who design and advocate for expanded welfare live according to traditional bourgeois values. They marry before having children, they work diligently, they defer gratification for future benefits. Yet they create policies that make such behaviors economically disadvantageous for the poor, then express surprise when social pathology increases rather than decreases. Chapter 2: Cultural Relativism and the Death of Standards. Perhaps no single intellectual poison has done more damage to both British and American civilization than the doctrine of cultural relativism. In my psychiatric practice, I witnessed its practical consequences. When society ceases to distinguish between right and wrong, healthy and pathological behavior, individuals lose the moral framework necessary for psychological stability. The relativist ideology that now dominates American universities and institutions was perfected in Britain decades earlier. British educators, social workers, and intellectuals convinced themselves that making moral judgments about behavior constituted cultural imperialism. The results were catastrophic. When teachers stopped correcting student misbehavior because all cultures were allegedly equal, classroom discipline collapsed. When social workers refused to criticize destructive lifestyle choices because that would be judgmental, child abuse and neglect flourished. When judges began treating criminal behavior as the inevitable product of social circumstances rather than personal choice, crime rates exploded. I treated countless patients whose lives had been destroyed by this moral abdication. Young men who had never been held accountable for anything developed no internal sense of right and wrong. Women who had been taught that all relationships were equally valid found themselves trapped in cycles of abuse because they couldn't distinguish between love and exploitation. Children raised without clear behavioral expectations became anxious, angry, and directionless because humans require moral structure for healthy psychological development. American intellectuals have embraced these same destructive doctrines with characteristic enthusiasm. In American schools, the concept of cultural competency now prevents teachers from expecting standard English, punctuality, or academic effort from minority students, supposedly to respect their cultural differences. This represents the same soft bigotry I observed in Britain, where low expectations disguised as tolerance condemn working-class children to lives of limited possibilities. The relativist assault on objective standards extends beyond education into every sphere of American life. In healthcare, I observe American colleagues who refuse to advise patients about obviously destructive behaviors because that would constitute imposing middle-class values. In criminal justice, American prosecutors increasingly treat crime as a public health problem rather than a moral failing, exactly as their British counterparts did with predictably disastrous results. Cultural relativism appeals to educated Americans for the same reason it appealed to educated Britons. It allows them to feel morally superior while avoiding the difficult work of actually upholding standards. It's much easier to declare all cultures equally valid than to defend the specific cultural achievements, individual responsibility, delayed gratification, respect for law, that created prosperous societies. The most insidious aspect of relativism is how it undermines the confidence of ordinary people in their own moral intuitions. When experts declare that distinguishing between right and wrong constitutes prejudice, decent people begin doubting their natural responses to destructive behavior. This moral confusion creates the psychological conditions for social breakdown. Chapter 3: The Sentimentalization of Social Policy. If you observe carefully how progressive policies are formulated and defended, you'll notice they appeal almost exclusively to sentiment rather than evidence. This represents one of the most destructive intellectual habits I've witnessed in both British and American public discourse: the substitution of emotional satisfaction for practical results. During my years in British hospitals, I watched policymakers implement program after program designed to make themselves feel compassionate rather than actually help patients. Drug rehabilitation programs that enabled rather than cured addiction continued receiving funding because they demonstrated caring. Housing policies that concentrated the most dysfunctional families in the same neighborhoods persisted because alternative approaches seemed harsh. Educational initiatives that systematically lowered standards survived because maintaining high expectations appeared elitist. The sentimentalist approach to social problems produces a characteristic pattern: policies are judged by their intentions rather than their consequences. When these well-intentioned policies produce obviously destructive results, sentimentalists respond not by changing course but by implementing more of the same policies with greater intensity. They cannot admit that their compassionate interventions might be causing harm because their identity depends on seeing themselves as caring people fighting against cruel indifference. American progressives have perfected this same sentimentalist approach. Consider how American cities respond to homelessness. Instead of addressing the underlying causes, primarily mental illness, drug addiction, and behavioral disorders, they focus on making themselves feel better by providing services that enable street living. The result is the transformation of entire neighborhoods into open-air psychiatric wards. But admitting this reality would require acknowledging that good intentions aren't sufficient for good outcomes. The sentimentalist corruption of American criminal justice follows the British model precisely. Instead of focusing on protecting law-abiding citizens from predators, American prosecutors increasingly emphasize restorative justice and addressing root causes. These approaches appeal to educated sensibilities but ignore what I learned from treating both criminals and their victims. Some people choose evil behavior regardless of their circumstances, and failing to respond with appropriate consequences encourages more such choices. In healthcare, American administrators implement policies designed to demonstrate cultural sensitivity rather than improve patient outcomes. Hospitals create elaborate protocols to avoid offending anyone while actual medical care deteriorates. This represents the same institutional priorities I observed in Britain. Appearing compassionate becomes more important than being effective. The most damaging aspect of sentimentalist policymaking is how it immunizes failed programs from criticism. Anyone who points out that these policies aren't working gets labeled as lacking compassion. The sentimentalist framework transforms empirical questions about effectiveness into moral questions about character, making rational evaluation impossible. This explains why American cities with the most progressive policies often have the worst outcomes for the populations they claim to help. The policies aren't designed to solve problems, they're designed to allow educated elites to feel virtuous while avoiding the difficult choices that actual problem-solving requires. Chapter 4: The Elite Capture of Educational Institutions. The transformation of education from knowledge transmission to ideological indoctrination represents perhaps the most successful progressive conquest in both Britain and America. Having observed this process across decades in both countries, I can attest that the destruction of educational standards follows a predictable pattern that serves elite interests while harming the students it claims to help. In British schools, I witnessed the systematic replacement of rigorous academic content with therapeutic interventions and social engineering. Teachers stopped teaching literature, history, and mathematics in favor of raising self-esteem and promoting social justice. The results were catastrophic. Working-class children who might have escaped their circumstances through education instead received elaborate excuses for their failure to learn. Meanwhile, middle-class children attended private schools that maintained traditional academic standards. American education has embraced these same destructive innovations with characteristic enthusiasm. The focus on student-centered learning and culturally responsive pedagogy represents the same abandonment of intellectual rigor I observed in Britain. When teachers spend more time validating student feelings than correcting student errors, academic achievement becomes impossible. Yet this failure gets reframed as evidence that traditional educational approaches were oppressive rather than effective. The most insidious aspect of educational degradation is how it's disguised as moral progress. Progressive educators claim they're making education more inclusive by lowering standards, more relevant by abandoning classical knowledge, and more empowering by treating student ignorance as alternative wisdom. These rhetorical strategies obscure the reality that educational failure disproportionately harms precisely the disadvantaged students that progressive education claims to serve. I've observed how this educational malpractice produces characteristic psychological damage. Students subjected to years of grade inflation and lowered expectations develop profound intellectual insecurity masked by artificial confidence. They receive degrees without acquiring knowledge, leaving them unprepared for careers requiring actual competence. When they inevitably encounter situations demanding skills they never developed, they experience anxiety and resentment that progressive educators then exploit to justify further lowering of standards. The higher education system compounds these problems by indoctrinating students with ideological frameworks that prevent honest analysis of social problems. American universities now function primarily as institutions for credentialing elite opinion rather than developing critical thinking. Students learn to recite progressive orthodoxies about inequality, oppression, and social justice without acquiring the intellectual tools necessary to evaluate these claims objectively. This educational corruption serves elite interests perfectly. When working-class children receive inferior education disguised as progressive pedagogy, they remain economically dependent and politically compliant. When middle-class children receive degrees in ideological conformity rather than practical skills, they join the ranks of educated professionals whose careers depend on perpetuating the systems that credentialed them. The psychological consequences extend beyond individual students to entire generations. Young Americans emerge from educational institutions believing they possess sophisticated understanding of complex social issues when they actually possess only slogans and emotional responses. This combination of ignorance and confidence makes them perfect vehicles for implementing policies they cannot evaluate critically. Chapter 5: The Linguistic Manipulation of Public Discourse. You must pay attention to how language gets systematically corrupted in service of progressive ideology, because controlling language represents the most effective method of controlling thought. In my years observing British and American public discourse, I've documented how the deliberate manipulation of vocabulary prevents honest discussion of social problems while advancing ideological goals through semantic deception. The progressive transformation of language follows predictable patterns. First, accurate descriptive terms get replaced with euphemisms that obscure rather than illuminate reality. British social workers stopped calling criminal behavior criminal and started calling it antisocial, as if robbery and assault were merely poor etiquette. American educators similarly transformed academic failure into alternative learning outcomes and behavioral problems into different learning styles. These linguistic changes aren't cosmetic, they prevent recognition of problems that require solutions. Second, moral categories get replaced with therapeutic ones. In both countries, I've observed how behaviors once understood as choices become redefined as symptoms. Drug addiction becomes a disease, criminal behavior becomes a cry for help, and personal irresponsibility becomes evidence of trauma. This therapeutic reframing serves progressive interests by removing moral judgment from public discourse while expanding the bureaucratic apparatus needed to address these newly medicalized problems. Third, traditional virtues get rebranded as pathologies while destructive behaviors get celebrated as authentic expressions of identity. Hard work becomes internalized oppression, academic achievement becomes acting white, and delayed gratification becomes evidence of privilege. Meanwhile, dependency becomes self-advocacy, educational failure becomes resistance to dominant culture, and criminal behavior becomes responding to systemic injustice. The most sophisticated form of linguistic manipulation involves creating new categories that appear neutral but advance specific ideological positions. Terms like cultural competence, social justice, and inclusive excellence sound benevolent but function as mechanisms for implementing progressive policies while making opposition appear bigoted. These phrases work precisely because they're difficult to argue against without seeming to oppose positive values. American institutions have embraced this linguistic manipulation with extraordinary thoroughness. Universities create elaborate vocabularies around diversity, equity, and inclusion that make traditional merit-based practices literally unspeakable. Healthcare systems adopt patient-centered care frameworks that prevent doctors from giving honest medical advice. Criminal justice systems implement restorative justice approaches that make protecting law-abiding citizens from predators conceptually impossible. The psychological impact of this linguistic corruption extends far beyond policy implementation. When people cannot name problems accurately, they cannot think about them clearly. When moral categories disappear from public vocabulary, individuals lose the conceptual tools necessary for ethical reasoning. When therapeutic language replaces moral language, personal responsibility becomes literally unthinkable. I've observed how this process creates profound cognitive dissonance among educated Americans. They know intuitively that certain behaviors and policies produce destructive results, but they lack acceptable language for expressing these observations. The resulting psychological tension gets resolved through ideological conformity rather than intellectual honesty. The most alarming aspect of progressive linguistic manipulation is how it makes empirical evaluation of social policies impossible. When failure gets redefined as success and harmful outcomes get rebranded as beneficial ones, the feedback mechanisms necessary for course correction disappear entirely. Chapter 6: The Psychology of Moral Relativism. Through decades of psychiatric practice, I've observed that moral relativism doesn't produce the tolerance and flexibility its advocates claim. Instead, it creates profound psychological instability in individuals and societies by destroying the moral framework humans require for healthy mental functioning. The relativist ideology now dominant in American institutions produces the same psychological pathology I documented in Britain's welfare-dependent populations. Human beings possess innate moral intuitions that evolved to enable cooperative social living. These intuitions create powerful psychological responses to fairness, reciprocity, and justice that persist regardless of intellectual commitments to relativist doctrine. When individuals are taught that these moral responses are culturally arbitrary rather than universally valid, they experience chronic internal conflict between their natural moral sense and their intellectual beliefs. I've treated countless patients whose mental health problems stem directly from this moral confusion. Young people raised to believe that all values are equally valid develop profound anxiety because they cannot distinguish between right and wrong choices. Adults who embrace relativist ideology often suffer from decision paralysis because they lack stable criteria for evaluation. Elderly patients who abandon traditional moral frameworks frequently experience depression and meaninglessness because relativism provides no basis for finding life significant. The relativist assault on objective moral standards produces particularly destructive effects in child development. Children require clear moral boundaries for healthy psychological growth, yet progressive educators systematically undermine parental authority by teaching that moral standards are culturally relative. The result is a generation of young people who cannot regulate their own behavior because they were never taught that some behaviors are objectively wrong. In clinical practice, I've observed how moral relativism functions as a sophisticated form of psychological defense against guilt and responsibility. Individuals who have made destructive choices find comfort in ideologies that deny objective moral standards because such denial eliminates the possibility of genuine moral failure. This explains why relativist doctrine appeals particularly to educated individuals whose lifestyle choices often contradict their stated values. The most insidious aspect of relativist psychology is how it breeds intolerance disguised as tolerance. When people believe that moral standards are arbitrary cultural constructions, they become extremely aggressive toward anyone who maintains objective moral commitments. Progressive institutions demonstrate this pattern constantly. They preach tolerance while systematically excluding anyone who believes in traditional moral categories. American universities perfectly exemplify this psychological contradiction. They celebrate diversity while maintaining strict ideological uniformity, promote inclusion while excluding dissenting viewpoints, and advocate tolerance while demonstrating extraordinary intolerance toward conservative perspectives. This behavior isn't hypocritical, it's the inevitable psychological result of relativist doctrine. Moral relativism also produces characteristic forms of displaced moral fervor. When people abandon traditional moral categories, they don't become less moralistic, they transfer their moral energy to political causes that provide substitute meaning. This explains the quasi-religious intensity that surrounds progressive political movements. They serve as secular replacements for traditional moral frameworks. The psychological appeal of relativism to educated elites stems partly from its function as class marker. Believing in objective moral standards gets stigmatized as unsophisticated, while embracing relativist complexity signals intellectual sophistication. This dynamic allows educated Americans to maintain social status while avoiding the difficult work of actually living according to demanding moral principles. Yet the same educated individuals who embrace relativism in public discourse typically organize their private lives according to traditional moral principles. They work hard, save money, maintain stable relationships, and invest heavily in their children's education. Their relativism applies only to other people's behavior. Chapter 7: Restoring Sanity Through Individual Resistance. Having diagnosed the pathological similarities between Britain's decline and America's current trajectory, I must address what individuals can do to resist these destructive trends. My clinical experience suggests that civilizational renewal begins with personal renewal, individual decisions to reject progressive orthodoxies and restore traditional standards in our own lives and immediate communities. The first requirement is intellectual honesty about what we observe rather than what we're supposed to believe. Progressive ideology depends on people ignoring evidence that contradicts approved narratives. Resist this intellectual conformity by trusting your own observations over expert opinions. When you see that welfare programs create dependency rather than independence, that lowered educational standards harm rather than help disadvantaged students, that cultural relativism produces chaos rather than harmony, believe your eyes rather than theoretical explanations that contradict obvious reality. Develop immunity to progressive linguistic manipulation by insisting on precise vocabulary. When someone uses terms like social justice, cultural competence, or inclusive excellence, demand specific definitions. Often you'll discover that these phrases function as euphemisms for policies that contradict their apparent meaning. Restore moral language to your personal vocabulary. Call criminal behavior criminal. Call educational failure failure. Call dependency dependency. Language shapes thought, so protecting accurate language protects clear thinking. In family life, implement the traditional standards that progressive institutions have abandoned. Teach your children that choices have consequences, that hard work produces better outcomes than victimhood narratives, that objective moral standards exist regardless of contemporary fashion. These lessons provide psychological immunity against ideological manipulation while developing character traits necessary for genuine success. Choose educational institutions and healthcare providers based on competence rather than ideological conformity. Seek teachers who maintain academic standards rather than those who prioritize social justice activism. Select doctors who provide honest medical advice rather than those who avoid difficult conversations to demonstrate cultural sensitivity. Support institutions that serve their stated functions rather than those that use their positions to advance political agendas. In professional contexts, resist pressure to participate in progressive ritual. Decline diversity training that treats traditional American values as pathological. Refuse to use preferred pronouns that contradict biological reality. Avoid hiring and promotion practices that prioritize demographic characteristics over qualifications. These stands require courage, but institutional compliance with progressive demands only accelerates civilizational decline. Engage in what I call constructive traditionalism, actively supporting institutions and practices that preserve what remains of Western civilization. Attend religious services that maintain doctrinal standards rather than those that accommodate contemporary fashion. Support classical education initiatives that teach actual knowledge rather than ideological conformity. Participate in community organizations that strengthen local social bonds rather than those that promote political activism. Develop financial and geographic independence from progressive institutions. Live in communities that maintain law and order rather than those that have embraced criminal justice reform. Choose occupations that reward competence rather than ideological compliance. Build savings that reduce dependence on government programs and corporate benefits tied to political conformity. Most importantly, maintain hope based on historical perspective. Progressive ideology appears dominant now, but its internal contradictions make long-term success impossible. Societies cannot function indefinitely on the basis of lies about human nature, economics, and moral reality. When progressive policies produce obviously destructive results, as they inevitably do, opportunities emerge for rational alternatives. The restoration of American civilization requires millions of individual decisions to reject progressive orthodoxy and return to the principles that created prosperity and freedom. This process begins with personal choice, the decision to live according to traditional values regardless of contemporary pressures to conform to destructive ideologies. Conclusion. America stands at the same crossroads Britain faced decades ago. Continue down the path of progressive experimentation that has already produced obvious social pathology, or rediscover the traditional principles that built Western civilization. My clinical experience treating the casualties of Britain's social experiments provides a clear warning about where current American policies lead. The welfare state destroys individual agency, cultural relativism breeds moral chaos, sentimentalist policies produce systematic cruelty, and progressive ideology corrupts every institution it captures. Yet unlike Britain, America retains constitutional traditions and cultural resources that make renewal possible. The question is whether enough Americans will choose the difficult path of restoration over the comfortable path of continued decline. This choice cannot be made collectively. It must be made by individuals who decide to live according to truth rather than fashionable lies. The future of American civilization depends not on political leaders or institutional reform, but on personal decisions to reject progressive orthodoxy and restore the standards that made prosperity and freedom possible. Choose wisely, for the consequences of these choices will determine not just America's future, but the future of Western civilization itself.